A Debt of the Heart. Washington, D.C., 1920. Lillian Wright threw Major Nathaniel Blackwood's letter into the fireplace, watching the flames consume it. The next morning, it lay perfectly intact on her desk, except for one new line at the bottom. "You can't ignore me forever." If this table of content looks good to you, I will start to provide the chapters. Chapter 1. The Unburnt Message. The scent of burnt paper, usually so acrid and final, was absent. Lillian Wright, her silver hair neatly pinned beneath a simple cloche hat, stared at the pristine white envelope resting innocently on her mahogany desk. It was the same envelope she'd tossed into the roaring fireplace just last night, the crackling flames licking at the cream-colored paper, devouring the elegant script of Major Nathaniel Blackwood. She'd watched, with a grim satisfaction, as the edges curled and blackened, the words themselves seeming to shrivel under the heat. Or so she thought. Now here it was. Untouched. Unblemished. Except Lillian leaned closer, her heart a trapped bird fluttering against her ribs. A new line, penned in the same bold, unmistakably masculine hand, adorned the bottom of the once empty back of the envelope. "You can't ignore me forever." A chill, sharper than the November wind whistling outside her Washington, D.C. townhouse, snaked down her spine. It wasn't just the impossible reappearance of the letter, it was the blatant, almost taunting, defiance of the message. She had tried to erase him, to consign him to the ashes of her past, a past she'd meticulously rebuilt after the war. A past he threatened to shatter. Lillian was no stranger to loss, to the brutal realities of the world. The Great War had taken her husband, Thomas, a kind, gentle soul who'd enlisted with a naive patriotism that had cost him everything. It had taken her brother, Edward, a brilliant surgeon who had volunteered at a field hospital near Amiens, only to succumb to the Spanish flu that had swept through the trenches with the same ruthless efficiency as German shells. She had grieved, she had rebuilt, and she had, with a steely resolve, moved on. But Nathaniel Blackwood, he was a different kind of loss. A loss she had chosen, a sacrifice she had made. A sacrifice that, apparently, refused to stay buried. She sank into her leather desk chair, the worn cushions offering little comfort. The room, usually a sanctuary of order and tranquility, felt suddenly oppressive. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a sound she usually found soothing, now echoed the relentless beat of her own anxious heart. The letter itself was a relic from 2 years ago, a missive sent from the muddy fields of France. It was filled with the usual wartime platitudes, descriptions of the relentless rain, the camaraderie of the men, the yearning for home. But beneath the surface, woven between the lines, was a different story. A story of stolen moments, whispered promises, and a love that had bloomed in the shadow of death. A love that was as forbidden as it was intoxicating. Lillian had met Nathaniel at a fundraising gala in London, a whirlwind of silk gowns and strained smiles, all orchestrated to bolster the war effort. He was an American officer, attached to the British Expeditionary Force, his uniform crisp, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, holding a depth of sorrow that mirrored her own. He was charming, witty, and undeniably handsome, but it was the vulnerability she glimpsed beneath the polished exterior that drew her in. Their connection was immediate, an unspoken understanding that transcended the polite chatter and forced gaiety of the wartime social scene. They found solace in each other's company, sharing quiet conversations in dimly lit corners, stealing moments away from the relentless pressure of their respective duties. Lillian, volunteering as a nurse at a nearby hospital, saw the horrors of war firsthand. Nathaniel, she knew, faced them head-on. Their relationship was a fragile thing, built on stolen moments and whispered words, a delicate flower pushing through the cracked pavement of a war-torn world. It was a secret, a dangerous one, and they both knew it. Lillian was a widow, yes, but she was also a woman of a certain standing, bound by societal expectations and the memory of her late husband. Nathaniel was a soldier, bound by duty and the ever-present threat of death. The letter, the one she'd tried to destroy, was his last communication before he was shipped back to the front. It was a plea, a declaration, a promise. A promise he now seemed intent on keeping. Lillian picked up the envelope, her fingers tracing the embossed initials, NB, on the flap. She had thought she could control this, that she could bury the past and move on. But the unburnt letter, with its defiant message, was a stark reminder that some things, some people, refuse to be forgotten. The knock on her door was firm, resolute. Lillian started, nearly dropping the letter. "Come in," she called, her voice surprisingly steady. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, a stout, no-nonsense woman who had been with the family for decades, entered the room. "A gentleman to see you, Mrs. Wright," she announced, her tone betraying a hint of disapproval. A Major Blackwood. Lillian's heart lurched. He was here. In Washington. In her home. The past she had so desperately tried to escape had arrived, uninvited, on her doorstep. She met Mrs. Davies's gaze, drawing on a lifetime of practiced composure. "Show him in," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil raging within. What was she to do? The war was supposed to be over, a neatly closed chapter of grief and sacrifice. But here it was, resurrected in the form of a man she had loved and lost, a man who held the power to unravel everything she had so carefully constructed. A man who would clearly not allow her to get away that easily. Chapter 2. Echoes of Amiens. The air in the drawing room thickened, heavy with unspoken words and the ghost of lavender and gunpowder. Lillian watched Nathaniel Blackwood cross the room, his presence filling the space in a way that seemed to shrink the familiar surroundings. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps it was simply the way he carried himself, the ramrod straight posture of a soldier, even out of uniform. He wore a well-tailored suit, the dark fabric emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders and the lean lines of his body. But it was his face that held her captive. The years had etched lines around his eyes, those startlingly blue eyes that still held the same unsettling intensity. There was a hardness there now, a weariness that hadn't been present in London, a shadow that spoke of battles fought and losses endured. The boyish charm she remembered had been tempered by something colder, something more dangerous. Yet, beneath that, she saw a flicker of the man she had fallen in love with, a spark of vulnerability that sent a tremor of something akin to longing through her. "Lillian," he said, his voice a low rumble that resonated deep within her. It was a voice she'd heard in her dreams, a voice that had whispered promises in the dark, a voice that had haunted her waking hours. "Major Blackwood," she replied, her own voice surprisingly steady. She held out her hand, a gesture of polite formality that felt absurd given the intimacy they had once shared. He took her hand, his grip firm but gentle, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. His fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary, and she saw a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He released her hand, and the absence of his touch felt like a sudden, sharp cold. "Please sit down," Lillian said, gesturing towards the two armchairs flanking the fireplace, the very fireplace that had failed to do its job. She chose the one opposite him, maintaining a careful distance. He sat, the movement graceful despite his size, and leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "I had to see you," he said, his voice devoid of preamble. The letter was a mistake," Lillian interrupted, her voice tight. "It should have been destroyed." A flicker of amusement, quickly suppressed, crossed his face. Evidently, fate had other plans. "Fate," Lillian scoffed, a trace of bitterness creeping into her voice. "Fate has been cruel enough, Major. I don't need it meddling further in my life." "Is that what I am, Lillian? Meddling?" He leaned back, his expression carefully neutral. I hoped that what we had was more than just a wartime fling, a fleeting moment of madness." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Lillian felt a flush creep up her neck. "It was a mistake," she repeated, her voice weaker this time. "A beautiful mistake, perhaps, but a mistake nonetheless. We were different people then, caught up in the intensity of the war. And are we so different now?" He challenged, his gaze piercing. "Have you truly forgotten everything, Lillian? The promises we made, the connection we shared?" Lillian closed her eyes, a wave of memories washing over her. The stolen kisses in the darkened corners of the hospital, the whispered conversations under the starless London sky, the desperate clinging to each other as the bombs fell around them. The raw, aching need for human connection in a world consumed by death and destruction. She had loved him, she realized with a pang of something akin to grief. She had loved him fiercely, desperately, recklessly. "I haven't forgotten," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But I've learned to live with it, to bury it, to move on." "And have you, Lillian? Truly moved on?" He leaned forward again, his eyes searching hers. "Or are you simply hiding, afraid of what might happen if you allow yourself to feel again?" His words struck a nerve, a raw, exposed nerve she had thought long since healed. She was hiding, she knew. Hiding behind the carefully constructed facade of the respectable widow, hiding from the pain, hiding from the memories, hiding from the possibility of being hurt again. "I have responsibilities," she said, her voice regaining some of its strength. "A life here, a reputation to uphold." "And what about your heart, Lillian? What about what you want?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Lillian looked away, unable to meet his gaze. She thought of Thomas, her late husband, a good and kind man she had respected but never truly loved in the way she had loved Nathaniel. She thought of her brother, Edward, lost to the war, a constant reminder of the fragility of life. She thought of the expectations of society, the suffocating constraints of her world. "What I want is irrelevant," she said finally, her voice flat. "What matters is what is right." "And what is right, Lillian?" Nathaniel asked softly. "Living a lie? Denying yourself happiness because of fear? Because of what others might think?" He stood up, his movements restless, and walked over to the window, looking out at the bustling street below. The sounds of the city, the clatter of carriages, the shouts of vendors, seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the silence between them, a silence filled with unspoken emotions. "I didn't come here to cause you pain, Lillian," he said, his voice low, his back still to her. "I came because I needed to know if there was still a chance. For us." Lillian felt a tear slip down her cheek, a tear she quickly brushed away. She had thought she was strong, that she had put the past behind her. But his presence, his words, his unwavering gaze, had shattered her carefully constructed defenses, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. She stood up, her legs trembling slightly, and walked towards him. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze fixed on his broad back. "There is no chance, Nathaniel," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "There can't be. The war, it changed everything. It changed us." He turned, his face etched with a mixture of pain and determination. "The war may have changed us, Lillian, but it didn't destroy what we had. It may have been buried, dormant, but it's still there. I feel it, and I believe you do too." He reached out, his hand hovering hesitantly over her cheek. Lillian didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She simply stood there, frozen, caught between the past and the present, between duty and desire, between a life she had built and the life she had secretly dreamed of. His fingers brushed against her skin, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver through her. And then, a sudden, sharp rap at the door shattered the fragile moment. "Mrs. Wright," Mrs. Davies's voice called from the other side, "there's a telegram for you. It seems urgent." The spell was broken. Lillian stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth. A telegram. In those days, a telegram almost always meant bad news. Her heart pounded with a sudden, premonitory dread. The echoes of Amiens, the ghosts of the war, had returned with a vengeance. Chapter 3. The Gentleman from the War Office. The telegram felt like a lead weight in Lillian's hand. The flimsy paper trembled, mirroring the sudden tremor in her own body. She glanced at Nathaniel, his face a mask of concern. The blue of his eyes darkened with a shared apprehension. The fragile intimacy of moments before had evaporated, replaced by the stark reality of their present circumstances. "Excuse me," Lillian murmured, her voice barely audible. She moved to her desk, her legs feeling strangely unsteady. She tore open the envelope with trembling fingers, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The message was brief, stark, and devastating. Regret to inform you Edward Wright's belongings recovered. France. Stop investigation underway. Stop details. To follow. Stop War Office. Stop Lillian Swade. The room tilting precariously. Edward. Her brother. The telegram couldn't be referring to that Edward. Her Edward had died 2 years ago, a victim of the Spanish flu. She had received the official notification, the carefully worded condolences, the heartbreaking details of his final days. She had mourned him, grieved for him, buried him in her heart alongside her husband. But the telegram belongings recovered investigation underway. The words swam before her eyes, blurring into an incomprehensible mess. It was a cruel joke, a twisted nightmare from which she couldn't awaken. Nathaniel was beside her in an instant, his strong arm encircling her waist, supporting her weight. Lillian? What is it? What's wrong? She couldn't speak. She simply handed him the telegram, her hand shaking uncontrollably. He read it quickly, his face paling, his jaw tightening. Edward, your brother? He asked, his voice hushed. But he died during the war. Lillian nodded, a sob escaping her lips. He did. I received the notification. I buried him. There must be some mistake, Nathaniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew, as she did, that the War Office rarely made mistakes of this magnitude. The room was silent, save for Lillian's ragged breathing and the ticking of the grandfather clock, each tick a hammer blow against her shattered composure. The past, which she had tried so desperately to bury, had risen up with a vengeance, threatening to consume her entirely. I don't understand, Lillian whispered, her voice breaking. What does it mean? Belongings recovered? What investigation? Nathaniel squeezed her hand, his touch a grounding force in the swirling chaos of her emotions. We'll find out, he said, his voice firm, resolute. I'll go to the War Office. I'll find out what's going on. He released her, but the warmth of his touch lingered, a phantom comfort in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. Stay here, he said. I'll be back as soon as I can. Lillian nodded, unable to speak. She watched him leave, his tall figure disappearing through the doorway, leaving her alone with the devastating telegram and the unraveling threads of her carefully constructed life. The hours that followed were a blur. Lillian paced the drawing room, her mind racing, her heart a knot of fear and confusion. She tried to make sense of the telegram, to find some logical explanation for the impossible message, but her thoughts were scattered, fragmented, like shards of broken glass. Mrs. Davies brought her tea, her face etched with concern, but Lillian couldn't bring herself to drink it. The familiar comfort of her home, the quiet elegance of her surroundings, offered no solace. The world outside, the world of normalcy and routine, seemed a distant, unreachable reality. Finally, as dusk began to settle, casting long shadows across the room, Nathaniel returned. He was not alone. Behind him stood a man in a dark suit, his face stern, his demeanor official. He was older than Nathaniel, with graying hair and sharp, assessing eyes. He carried a briefcase, its leather worn and scuffed, as if it held the weight of countless secrets and sorrows. Lillian, Nathaniel said, his voice gentle, "This is Mr. Alistair Finch, from the War Office." Mr. Finch stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mrs. Wright," he said, his voice formal but not unkind. "I'm very sorry to intrude, but I'm afraid we have some rather delicate matters to discuss." Lillian took his hand, her own trembling slightly. "Please," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Tell me what's going on. Tell me about my brother." Mr. Finch gestured towards the armchairs. "Perhaps we should sit down." They sat, Lillian and Nathaniel on one side, Mr. Finch on the other. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant, broken only by the crackling of the fire, a fire that now seemed to mock her with its warmth. Mr. Finch opened his briefcase, extracting a file, its pages thick and filled with the meticulous script of officialdom. He cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on Lillian. "Mrs. Wright," he began, his voice measured, "as you know, your brother, Dr. Edward Wright, served with distinction as a surgeon in the British Expeditionary Force. He was stationed at a field hospital near Amiens, where he tragically succumbed to influenza in 1918. Lillian nodded, her throat tight. She had heard this story before, had lived through the agonizing details of his illness and death. However, Mr. Finch continued, his voice dropping slightly, recent events have cast doubt on the official account of your brother's death. Lillian felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? Mr. Finch hesitated, his gaze shifting to Nathaniel, then back to Lillian. A few weeks ago, he said, a French farmer, while plowing his field near the site of the former field hospital, unearthed a cache of personal belongings. Among them were items identified as belonging to your brother. He paused, allowing the words to sink in. Lillian felt a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. These items, Mr. Finch continued, included a journal, a medical kit, and a letter. A letter addressed to you. A letter. Another letter. Lillian felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. The contents of the journal and the letter, Mr. Finch said, his voice carefully neutral, suggests that your brother may have discovered something. Something that put him in danger.
Danger?
Lillian whispered, her voice trembling. What kind of danger? Mr. Finch leaned forward, his gaze intense. Mrs. Wright, he said, we believe your brother may have uncovered evidence of espionage, and that his death may not have been from natural causes. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Lillian stared at him, her mind reeling. Espionage? Murder? It was all too much, too unbelievable. Her brother, a doctor, a healer, a man of science involved in espionage? It was absurd. And yet the telegram, the recovered belongings, the letter, it all pointed to a truth far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. The gentleman from the War Office had just blown a hole through her carefully constructed reality, and standing beside her, Major Nathaniel Blackwood, seemed to be the only thing holding her shattered world together. Chapter 4. A dance of shadows and secrets. The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like the smoke from a battlefield. Lillian stared at Mr. Finch, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of her gentle, scholarly brother with the shadowy world of spies and subterfuge. Edward, a man who had dedicated his life to healing, to saving lives, now implicated in a conspiracy that may have cost him his own. I don't understand, Lillian said, her voice shaking. Edward was a doctor, not a spy. Mr. Finch sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. Mrs. Wright, the war created strange bedfellows. Doctors, nurses, even clergymen, they were all recruited, some willingly, some not, to gather information, to pass messages, to do things that would normally be unthinkable. He paused, his gaze softening slightly. Your brother was in a unique position. He had access to information, to people he could move freely between the lines, tending to the wounded of both sides. He was an ideal candidate. But he would never have agreed to that, Lillian protested. He was a pacifist. He abhorred violence. Perhaps, Mr. Finch conceded. Or perhaps he saw it as a way to end the violence, to bring the war to a quicker conclusion. We may never know his true motivations. He opened the file again, extracting a photograph. It was a faded, sepia-toned image of Edward, taken shortly before he left for France. He was smiling, his eyes bright with a naive optimism that now seemed heartbreakingly misplaced. Lillian felt a lump form in her throat, a wave of grief washing over her anew. This was found among his belongings, Mr. Finch said, handing her the photograph. Along with this, he produced a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with Edward's meticulous handwriting, a mixture of medical observations, personal reflections, and coded entries. Lillian took the journal, her fingers tracing the familiar script. She recognized some of the entries, descriptions of his work at the field hospital, his growing disillusionment with the war, his longing for home. But interspersed among these were passages that made no sense, strings of numbers, cryptic phrases, references to people and places she didn't recognize. We've had our cryptographers working on it, Mr. Finch said. But it's a complex code. We've only managed to decipher a few fragments. He pointed to a specific entry. This, for example, refers to a meeting with someone identified only as the Nightingale. We believe this was a code name for a high-ranking German agent. Lillian felt a chill run down her spine. The Nightingale. The name conjured images of darkness, of treachery, of betrayal. And this, Mr. Finch continued, pointing to another entry, refers to a package. We believe this was some kind of information, something your brother was supposed to deliver, or perhaps intercept. He looked at Lillian, his gaze intense. Mrs. Wright, we believe your brother stumbled upon something significant, something that threatened powerful people, and that they silenced him. The word hung in the air, stark and brutal. Silenced. Murdered. Lillian felt a wave of nausea wash over her. But the influenza, she whispered. The official report the influenza was a convenient cover, Mr. Finch said, his voice grim. It was rampant in the trenches, claiming thousands of lives. It was easy to make it look like another casualty of the epidemic. He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Mrs. Wright, we need your help. You were the closest person to your brother. You may hold the key to unlocking his secrets, to identifying the people involved, to bringing them to justice. Lillian felt overwhelmed. She was a woman of letters, a nurse, a widow, not a detective, not a spy. She was ill-equipped to navigate this treacherous world of espionage and intrigue. But she also knew that she couldn't stand idly by. Her brother had been murdered, his memory tarnished, his life reduced to a footnote in a conspiracy. She owed it to him, to his memory, to uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous, no matter how painful. She looked at Nathaniel, his face a mixture of concern and determination. He had been silent throughout the conversation, listening intently, his presence a steadying force in the swirling chaos of her emotions. I don't know what I can do, Lillian said, her voice trembling. But I'll help in any way I can. Mr. Finch nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. Thank you, Mrs. Wright. Your cooperation is invaluable. He closed the file, his demeanor shifting back to one of official formality. We'll need to examine your brother's journal more closely. And the letter will need to see that as well. Lillian hesitated. The letter. The one she had tried to destroy. The one that had brought Nathaniel back into her life. She hadn't mentioned it to Mr. Finch, hadn't even considered its relevance to the investigation. But now, as she looked at Nathaniel, his eyes questioning, she realized that it might be more important than she had ever imagined. It was a link to the past, a connection to her brother, a potential clue in the unraveling mystery of his death. There is a letter, she said, her voice hesitant. From my brother. It arrived shortly before I received the news of his death. Mr. Finch's eyebrows rose. And you have this letter? Lillian nodded. Yes. But she glanced at Nathaniel, her cheeks flushing. It's rather personal. Mr. Finch's gaze followed hers, lingering on Nathaniel for a moment. He seemed to understand the unspoken subtext, the hidden complexities of their relationship. I assure you, Mrs. Wright, he said, his voice carefully neutral, any information, no matter how personal, could be crucial to our investigation. We'll treat it with the utmost discretion. He paused, his gaze shifting back to Lillian. We'll need to see the letter as soon as possible. And Major Blackwood, he added, turning to Nathaniel, your assistance would also be greatly appreciated. You were stationed in France during the war. You may have insights that could be helpful. Nathaniel nodded, his expression grim. I'll do whatever I can. The meeting ended shortly thereafter. Mr. Finch left, taking Edward's journal with him, promising to keep Lillian informed of any progress. Lillian and Nathaniel were left alone, the weight of the revelation settling upon them like a shroud. They were no longer simply two people grappling with a forbidden love, a past that refused to stay buried. They were now caught up in a dangerous game of shadows and secrets, a dance with forces far more powerful and sinister than they could have ever imagined. The dance had begun, and neither of them knew where it would lead. Not even where they stood with one another any longer. Chapter 5. The Lavender and Gunpowder Scent. The scent of lavender and gunpowder. It was a peculiar combination, one that Lillian associated inextricably with Nathaniel. The lavender was from the small sachet she had given him, a token of remembrance, a fragile piece of home to carry with him into the brutal reality of the trenches. The gunpowder that was the scent of war, of death, of the ever-present danger that had surrounded them both. Now, as she sat across from him in the dimly lit drawing room, the scent seemed to permeate the air, a tangible reminder of the past, of the secrets they shared, of the dangerous path they were now embarking on. The letter, Nathaniel said, his voice low, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Your brother's letter. Do you want to tell me about it? Lillian hesitated. The letter was a private thing, a deeply personal communication between her and Edward. It contained his thoughts, his fears, his suspicions. It was also, she now realized, a potential piece of evidence, a clue in the unraveling mystery of his death. She retrieved the letter from her desk, the envelope worn and creased, the handwriting unmistakably Edward's. She had read it countless times, searching for some hidden meaning, some clue that might explain his fate. But it had remained stubbornly enigmatic, a jumble of personal reflections and cryptic references. I don't know what to make of it, Lillian admitted, handing him the letter. It's mostly about his work at the hospital, his feelings about the war, but there are parts that don't make sense. Nathaniel took the letter, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a familiar shiver through her. He unfolded the pages carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read. The room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the rustling of the paper. Lillian watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw his expression change as he read, his eyes widening, his jaw tightening. This part here, he said, pointing to a specific passage. The nightingale sings a dangerous tune. I fear I have heard too much. The package must be secured. Does that mean anything to you? Lillian shook her head.
No.
I've read it over and over, but I don't understand. It was the same passage Mr. Finch had highlighted in Edward's journal. The nightingale. The package. Pieces of a puzzle she couldn't assemble. Nathaniel continued reading, his expression growing increasingly grim. And this, Tallel, to trust no one. Especially not. The sentence is unfinished. Nathaniel looked up, an unreadable emotion in those deep-set eyes. It's torn. As if he was interrupted. Lillian felt a chill run down her spine. Interrupted. Silenced. The words echoed Mr. Finch's earlier pronouncements, confirming her worst fears. He knew, she whispered, her voice trembling. He knew he was in danger. Nathaniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the letter. It seems so. And he was trying to warn you. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. Lillian, he said, his voice serious, this letter, it changes things. It confirms what Finch suspected. Your brother was murdered. And we're now in the middle of it. The reality of their situation sunk in, heavy and suffocating. They were no longer simply dealing with the past, with a forbidden love, with a wartime romance. They were dealing with a conspiracy, a murder, a dangerous web of secrets that could engulf them both. What do we do? Lillian asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nathaniel hesitated. He was a soldier, trained to fight, to protect, to follow orders. But this was different. This was a shadowy world of espionage, of deception, of betrayal. He was out of his element, unsure of the rules, uncertain of the players. We need to be careful, he said finally. We need to trust no one, except each other. The words hung in the air, a fragile bond between them.
Trust.
It was a precious commodity, easily broken, difficult to repair. They had trusted each other once, in the midst of war, in the face of death. Could they trust each other again? Now, in this new and even more dangerous battle? Lillian looked at him, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and longing. She saw the strength in his jaw, the determination in his eyes, the vulnerability beneath the hardened exterior. She saw the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had shared her secrets, her dreams, her fears. I trust you, Nathaniel, she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. He reached out, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, reassuring, a grounding force in the swirling chaos of her emotions. "And I trust you, Lillian," he said, his voice low, his gaze unwavering. It was a promise, a vow, a declaration of alliance in the face of overwhelming odds. They were bound together, not just by the past, by the memory of their love, but by the present, by the shared danger, by the quest for justice for her brother. But even as she held his hand, even as she felt the warmth of his touch, Lillian couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense of foreboding that settled over her like a shroud. Edward's warning echoed in her mind. Trust no one. Not even, perhaps, the man sitting across from her, the man she loved, the man who held her fate in his hands. Because she couldn't be sure anymore if he was truly on her side or a subtly placed pawn in this deadly game. Chapter 6. Beneath a Sky of Lies. The days that followed were a blur of hushed conversations, clandestine meetings, and a growing sense of unease. Lillian and Nathaniel, bound together by the shared secret of Edward's letter and the looming investigation, moved through their lives like actors on a stage, playing their assigned roles while concealing the dangerous truth beneath. Lillian continued her routine, attending to her social obligations, maintaining the facade of the respectable widow, while her mind raced with questions and suspicions. She found herself scrutinizing everyone she encountered, searching for clues, for any hint of deception, for any connection to the shadowy world of espionage that had claimed her brother's life. Nathaniel, using his military connections and his own sharp instincts, began his own investigation, discreetly gathering information, following leads, trying to piece together the fragments of Edward's puzzle. He spent hours at the War Office, poring over documents, interviewing former colleagues, chasing down rumors and whispers. They met in secret, usually in the quiet seclusion of Lillian's drawing room, the curtains drawn, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. They shared their findings, their suspicions, their fears, their words hushed, their glances guarded. "I spoke to a colleague who served with Edward in Amiens," Nathaniel said one evening, his voice low, his expression troubled. He remembers Edward being withdrawn, secretive, in the weeks before his death. He said he was often seen meeting with a woman, a nurse. Lillian felt a jolt of surprise. A nurse, a woman. Could this be the Nightingale? The mysterious German agent Mr. Finch had mentioned? Did he know her name? Lillian asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nathaniel shook his head. No. He only saw them together a few times from a distance. He described her as tall, slender, with dark hair. He said she wore a distinctive red scarf. A red scarf. The detail resonated with Lillian, stirring a vague memory, a fleeting image from her own time volunteering at the hospital in London. She had seen a nurse with a red scarf, a striking woman with an air of mystery. Could it be the same woman? I think I might know her, Lillian said, her voice hesitant. I saw a nurse with a red scarf at the hospital in London. I don't remember her name, but I remember her face. Nathaniel's eyes widened. Can you describe her? Lillian closed her eyes, trying to conjure the image. She was beautiful, she said slowly. Tall, as your colleague said, with dark, almost black hair and piercing blue eyes. She had a certain air about her, a confidence that set her apart. Did you ever speak to her? Nathaniel asked. Lillian shook her head. No. I only saw her from a distance. But I remember feeling uneasy around her, as if she was hiding something. A chilling premonition. A warning she had ignored. Nathaniel leaned forward, his gaze intense. Lillian, this could be a significant lead. If we can find this woman, she might be able to tell us something about Edward, about the Nightingale, about everything. But finding her, Lillian knew, would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. The war had scattered people across the globe, displaced them, changed them, erased them. The nurse with the red scarf could be anywhere or nowhere. Their investigation continued, a slow, painstaking process of gathering information, connecting dots, chasing down leads that often led to dead ends. They uncovered more details about Edward's activities in the weeks before his death, his clandestine meetings, his coded messages, his growing paranoia. They learned that the package Edward had referred to in his letter was a list of names, of British officers who were secretly working for the Germans. A list that, if it had fallen into the wrong hands, could have had devastating consequences for the war effort. They also learned that the Nightingale was a master of disguise, a chameleon who could blend seamlessly into any environment, a spy who had infiltrated the highest levels of British society. A woman who was ruthless, cunning, and utterly without scruple. The more they learned, the more dangerous their situation became. They were playing a game with a deadly opponent, an opponent who had already killed once, and who wouldn't hesitate to kill again. Lillian found herself increasingly drawn to Nathaniel, relying on his strength, his courage, his unwavering support. He was her anchor in the storm, her protector, her confidant. The forbidden love that had blossomed between them during the war had been rekindled, fueled by shared danger, by shared grief, by the desperate need for human connection in a world consumed by lies and betrayal. But even as she clung to him, even as she found solace in his arms, a nagging doubt persisted. Edward's warning echoed in her mind. Trust no one. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something, that there was a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. A piece that, if she could only find it, would reveal the truth, not just about Edward's death, but about everything, including, perhaps, a devastating betrayal that lay closer than she dared to imagine. The sky above them, once a symbol of hope, now seemed to be woven from the very fabric of deceit. Chapter 7. The Scars He Carried. The physical scars were the easiest to see. A jagged line across Nathaniel's left shoulder, a souvenir from a German shell near Ypres. A smaller, almost invisible scar above his right eyebrow, the result of a close encounter with a bayonet in the trenches of the Somme. Lillian had seen them, touched them, traced them with her fingertips during their stolen moments in London, her heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and tenderness. But it was the invisible scars, the ones he carried deep within, that were the most profound, the most enduring. The scars of loss, of guilt, of the horrors he had witnessed, of the things he had been forced to do. Those were the scars that haunted him, that shaped him, that made him the man he was. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions, Lillian decided to broach the subject, to delve into the darkness that she knew he carried within. Tell me, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Tell me about the war. About what you went through. Nathaniel hesitated, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. He rarely spoke of his experiences, preferring to keep them locked away, buried deep within the recesses of his mind. It was a defense mechanism, a way of protecting himself, of protecting her, from the brutal realities of war. It's not a pretty story, Lillian, he said, his voice rough. I know, she replied. But I need to understand. I need to know the man you are. The man you've become. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and longing. He saw the compassion in her gaze, the understanding, the unwavering support. And he knew that he could trust her, that he could share his burden with her, that she wouldn't judge him, that she wouldn't flinch from the darkness. He took a deep breath and began to speak. He told her about the relentless rain, the mud, the rats, the stench of death that permeated everything. He told her about the constant fear, the adrenaline, the numbing routine of trench warfare. He told her about the camaraderie of the men, the bonds forged in the face of unimaginable horrors. He told her about the battles he had fought, the lives he had taken, the friends he had lost. He told her about the guilt that gnawed at him, the nightmares that haunted him, the feeling of helplessness in the face of overwhelming destruction. He told her about a particular incident, one that had left an indelible scar on his soul. He had been leading a patrol through no man's land, a treacherous expanse of mud and barbed wire between the opposing trenches. They had been ambushed, caught in a hail of machine gun fire. I saw my men, my friends, fall around me, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I tried to save them, but it was too late. He paused, his eyes clouding over with the memory. I was the only one who made it back. Alive. The guilt, the survivor's guilt, was a heavy burden, one he had carried for years. He had been spared, while others, better men than him, had perished. He couldn't understand why, couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't deserve to live. Lillian reached out, her hand covering his. Her touch was warm, reassuring, a silent expression of empathy and understanding. "It wasn't your fault, Nathaniel," she said softly. "You did everything you could. You were a soldier following orders. You were a hero." He shook his head, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "There are no heroes in war, Lillian. Only survivors. And the dead." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "I've seen things, done things that I can never forget. Things that haunt me. Things that make me question who I am." Lillian squeezed his hand, her gaze unwavering. "The war changes everyone, Nathaniel. It leaves its mark on all of us. But it doesn't define us. It doesn't diminish the good in us." She leaned closer, her voice gentle. "You are a good man, Nathaniel. A brave man. A kind man. The war, it may have scarred you, but it hasn't destroyed you." Her words were a balm to his soul, a soothing reassurance in the face of his inner demons. He had carried his burden alone for so long, afraid to share it, afraid of being judged, afraid of being rejected. But Lillian, with her compassion, her understanding, her unwavering love, had offered him a glimpse of redemption, a chance to heal, a possibility of forgiveness. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative kiss, a hesitant exploration, a fragile bridge between the past and the present. It deepened, becoming more passionate, more desperate, a desperate clinging to each other in the face of the darkness that surrounded them. The scars he carried, both visible and invisible, were a part of him, a testament to the horrors he had endured. But they were also a reminder of his strength, his resilience, his capacity for love. And in that moment, as he held Lillian in his arms, he felt a flicker of hope, a glimmer of light in the long, dark night of his soul. The scars remained, but, for the first time, they didn't seem quite so insurmountable. Chapter 8. A Promise Forged in Fire. The fire in the hearth crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the walls of Lillian's drawing room, a stark contrast to the chilling conversation that had just transpired. The air was thick with unspoken promises, with shared vulnerabilities, and with the ever-present threat of the investigation that had thrown them together. Nathaniel, his hand still intertwined with Lillian's, broke the silence. "Finch wants us to go to Amiens." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. Amiens. The name conjured images of muddy trenches, makeshift hospitals, and the constant thunder of artillery fire. It was the place where Edward had died, the place where his secrets lay buried, the place where their own dangerous path had begun. Amiens, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Why?" "He believes the key to unraveling Edward's murder lies there," Nathaniel explained. "He wants us to retrace Edward's steps, to talk to people who knew him, to define the Nightingale." The Nightingale. The elusive spy, the woman with the red scarf, the potential murderer. The thought of confronting her sent a shiver of fear down Lillian's spine. "It's dangerous," Lillian said, stating the obvious. Nathaniel nodded, his expression grim. "Yes. But it's also necessary. We can't uncover the truth from here. We need to go to the source." He squeezed her hand, his touch reassuring. "I won't let anything happen to you, Lillian. I promise." It was a promise forged in fire, a vow made in the face of danger, a commitment that echoed the promises they had made to each other during the war. But this time, the stakes were even higher, the danger even more real. Lillian looked at him, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and longing. She trusted him, she loved him, but she also knew that promises made in the heat of the moment could be broken, that circumstances could change, that even the strongest bonds could be severed. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. Not with you." It was a lie, of course. She was terrified, but she was also determined. She wouldn't let fear paralyze her, wouldn't let it prevent her from seeking justice for her brother, from uncovering the truth, from protecting the man she loved. They spent the next few days preparing for their journey, making arrangements, gathering information, steeling themselves for the challenges ahead. Lillian packed her bags, her mind filled with a mixture of trepidation and anticipation. She included warm clothes, sturdy shoes, and a small, leather-bound journal, a gift from Edward, in which she planned to record her observations, her thoughts, her fears. Nathaniel, using his military connections, secured passage on a ship bound for France. He also arranged for accommodations in Amiens, a small, discreet hotel near the site of the former field hospital. The day of their departure arrived, a gray, overcast morning that mirrored Lillian's mood. They stood on the deck of the ship, watching the receding coastline of America, their faces turned towards the uncertain future that awaited them across the ocean. The voyage was long and arduous, the sea rough, the weather unpredictable. Lillian spent much of her time in her cabin, reading Edward's letters, studying his journal, trying to decipher the cryptic entries, searching for any clue that might shed light on his final days. Nathaniel, restless and anxious, paced the deck, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his mind filled with strategies and contingencies. He knew that they were walking into a dangerous situation, that they were facing an enemy who was cunning, ruthless, and utterly without scruple. As the ship approached the shores of France, Lillian felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition of danger that settled over her like a shroud. The memories of the war, the images of suffering and loss, the echoes of gunfire and explosions, came flooding back, overwhelming her senses. They arrived in Amiens on a cold, rainy afternoon. The town, still bearing the scars of war, seemed a bleak and desolate place. The streets were muddy, the buildings damaged, the people wary and withdrawn. Their hotel, a small, unassuming establishment on a quiet side street, offered little comfort. The rooms were sparsely furnished, the walls thin, the air damp and chilly. As they settled into their rooms, Lillian couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being followed, of being surrounded by unseen eyes. The atmosphere of the town, the weight of its history, the secrets it held, pressed down on her, suffocating her. That evening, as they sat in the hotel's dimly lit dining room, picking at their meager meal, Nathaniel spoke, his voice low, his gaze guarded. "We need to be careful, Lillian," he said. "We don't know who we can trust. We don't know who might be watching us." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, reassuring, a tangible connection in a world of uncertainty and danger. "We'll face this together," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "We'll find the truth. We'll get justice for Edward. And we'll come through this. Together." It was another promise, a reaffirmation of their bond, a declaration of their shared purpose. But as Lillian looked into his eyes, as she felt the weight of his hand on hers, she couldn't help but wonder if it was a promise they could keep. The fire of Amiens, both literal and metaphorical, had forged their bond, but it also threatened to consume them both. Chapter 9. The Serpent in the Garden. Amiens, in the pale light of a November morning, was a city of ghosts. The remnants of war were everywhere: shattered buildings, pockmarked streets, and the ever-present mud that seemed to cling to everything, a persistent reminder of the trenches. Lillian, walking beside Nathaniel through the town square, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was a chill of memory, of loss, of the lingering presence of death. They were on their way to the site of the former field hospital, the place where Edward had spent his last days, the place where his secrets lay buried. Nathaniel, using his military contacts, had obtained a map of the area, a crude sketch that showed the layout of the tents, the location of the operating theaters, the position of the morgue. As they walked, Lillian noticed the stares of the locals, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. They were outsiders, strangers in a town that had seen too much suffering, too much betrayal. She felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling of being watched, of being followed. They reached the outskirts of the town, where the fields began, stretching out towards the horizon, a vast expanse of mud and stubble. The field hospital, Nathaniel explained, had been dismantled after the war, its tents struck, its equipment dispersed, its occupants scattered. But the ground itself, Lillian knew, held the memories, the secrets, the ghosts of the past. They found the site, marked by a few crumbling foundations, a rusted piece of medical equipment, a scattering of broken tiles. It was a desolate, windswept place, haunted by the cries of the wounded, the whispers of the dying, the silent screams of the dead. Lillian stood there, her heart aching, her mind filled with images of Edward, of his work, of his dedication, of his final days. She could almost see him, moving among the tents, tending to the wounded, fighting a losing battle against death and disease. Nathaniel, sensing her grief, put his arm around her, his touch a silent comfort. "He was a good man, Lillian," he said softly. "A brave man." Lillian nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to save him. They began to explore the site, searching for any clue, any sign, any remnant of Edward's presence. They examined the crumbling foundations, sifted through the rubble, peered into the overgrown ditches. They found nothing. The site had been picked clean, scavenged, erased by time and the elements. There was nothing left, nothing to connect them to Edward, nothing to help them unravel the mystery of his death. As they were about to give up, Lillian noticed something, a faint glimmer of color in the mud. She knelt down, her fingers digging into the cold, wet earth. She unearthed a small, tarnished object, a silver locket, shaped like a flower. She recognized it instantly. It was a gift she had given to Edward, a token of her love, a symbol of their bond. He had worn it always, she knew, tucked inside his uniform, close to his heart. The locket was empty. The photograph it had once held, a picture of Lillian and Edward as children, was gone. Lillian felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of grief and hope. The locket was a tangible link to Edward, a proof of his presence, a clue, perhaps, to his fate. "He was here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He was really here." Nathaniel knelt beside her, examining the locket. He noticed something, a small inscription on the back, barely visible beneath the tarnish. He took out his pocket knife, carefully cleaning the inscription. He read it aloud, his voice hushed. "To E from N. With love, always." Lillian stared at him, her mind reeling.
And Nathaniel?
Could it be? Had Nathaniel given this locket to Edward?
But why?
And what did it mean? With love, always? The implications were staggering. A romantic relationship? A close friendship? Or something more sinister? Something connected to the espionage, to the Nightingale, to Edward's murder? The serpent had entered the garden. The trust, the fragile bond between Lillian and Nathaniel, had been shattered, replaced by suspicion, by doubt, by the chilling realization that she might be standing next to the very person who had betrayed her brother. The seemingly idyllic, yet dangerous, world they had built together was beginning to crumble, revealing a hidden landscape of deception. Chapter 10. Whispers Across the Wire. The locket lay cold and heavy in Lillian's palm, a tangible symbol of the betrayal that now coiled between her and Nathaniel. The inscription, to E from N. With love, always, echoed in her mind, a mocking counterpoint to the promises they had shared, to the trust they had so carefully cultivated. She looked at Nathaniel, his face etched with a mixture of confusion and concern, his blue eyes questioning. He hadn't denied it. He hadn't explained it. He had simply stood there, silent, allowing the damning evidence to speak for itself. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice trembling, her throat tight with unshed tears. What does this mean?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers, avoiding her accusing stare. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, seemingly struggling to find the words. "Lillian, he began, his voice faltering. "I can explain." "Explain?" she repeated, her voice rising, a sharp edge of anger cutting through her grief. "Explain how you gave my brother a locket? A locket inscribed with your initial? A locket that says with love, always?" He ran a hand through his hair, his expression anguished. It's not what you think," he said, his voice low. "Then what is it?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Tell me, Nathaniel. Tell me the truth." He took a deep breath, his gaze finally meeting hers. "Edward, he was a friend," he said, his voice hesitant. "A close friend. We met during the war. We helped each other. We relied on each other."
Friend?
Lillian scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Is that what you call it? A friend? You give your friends lockets? With love inscriptions?" He flinched, his face paling. "It was a different time, Lillian," he said, his voice pleading. "The war had changed everything. It had created bonds that were unconventional." "Unconventional?" she repeated, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Is that your euphemism for what? For a forbidden relationship? For a betrayal of your duty? For a connection to the Nightingale?" He stared at her, his eyes widening in shock. "The Nightingale? What are you talking about? Don't play innocent with me, Nathaniel," Lillian cried, her voice breaking. "You knew Edward was involved in something dangerous. You knew about the Nightingale. You knew he was going to die." He shook his head, his expression distraught.
No, Lillian.
"That's not true. I didn't know. I swear. I would never have betrayed him. Or you." But his words rang hollow, empty, unconvincing. The locket, the inscription, the circumstantial evidence, it all pointed to a different truth, a truth that shattered Lillian's heart, a truth that made her question everything she had believed, everything she had felt. She turned away from him, her body trembling, her mind reeling. She couldn't bear to look at him, couldn't bear to see the lies in his eyes, couldn't bear to face the devastating reality of his betrayal. I need to be alone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She walked away, leaving him standing there, alone amidst the ruins of the field hospital, alone with his secrets, alone with the guilt that she now knew he carried. She walked for hours, her feet carrying her aimlessly through the muddy fields, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She felt betrayed, heartbroken, angry, confused, lost. She didn't know where to go, what to do, who to trust. She found herself back at the hotel, her clothes soaked, her body chilled, her spirit broken. She went to her room, locked the door, and collapsed onto the bed, burying her face in the pillow, sobbing uncontrollably. The tears eventually subsided, leaving her drained, exhausted, numb. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the day, the discovery of the locket, the confrontation with Nathaniel, the shattering of her illusions. She realized that she was alone, truly alone, in a dangerous and unfamiliar world. She had no one to turn to, no one to trust, no one to help her. She was on her own, facing an enemy she didn't understand, a conspiracy that had already claimed her brother's life and that now threatened her own. But even in her despair, a spark of determination flickered within her. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let Edward's murder go unpunished. She wouldn't let Nathaniel's betrayal break her. She would find the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how dangerous. She got up, washed her face, and changed her clothes. She sat down at the small desk in her room, took out her journal, and began to write. She recorded everything she had learned, everything she suspected, everything she felt. She wrote about Edward, about his life, about his death, about his secrets. She wrote about Nathaniel, about their love, about their betrayal, about the shattered trust. She wrote about the Nightingale, about the locket, about the investigation, about the danger that surrounded her. As she wrote, a plan began to form in her mind. A dangerous plan, a reckless plan, but a plan that might lead her to the truth. A plan that involved using the very whispers across the wire, the coded messages, the clandestine meetings, the web of espionage itself, to uncover the killer and bring them to justice. She would enter the dance, even if it meant dancing with the devil himself. Or, in this case, herself. Chapter 11. The Price of Loyalty. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. Lillian, armed with Edward's journal, the cryptic letter, and the unsettling knowledge of Nathaniel's connection to her brother, decided to use herself as bait. She would infiltrate the shadowy network of spies and informants that Edward had stumbled upon, hoping to draw out the Nightingale and uncover the truth behind his murder. She knew the risks. She was a woman alone, in a foreign country, with no experience in espionage, facing an enemy who was cunning, ruthless, and utterly without scruple. But she was also driven by a fierce determination, by a burning desire for justice, by a desperate need to understand the betrayal that had shattered her world. She started by revisiting Edward's journal, studying the coded entries, the cryptic phrases, the references to people and places she didn't recognize. She cross-referenced the journal with the letter he had sent her, searching for any connection, any clue that might lead her to the Nightingale. She discovered a recurring phrase, le chat noir, the black cat. It appeared multiple times in both the journal and the letter, always in connection with clandestine meetings, with coded messages, with the exchange of information. Lillian, using her limited French and the help of a sympathetic hotel clerk, learned that Le Chat Noir was a small, unassuming cafe in a quiet corner of Amiens, a place known for its discreet clientele, a place where secrets were whispered and deals were made. She decided to go there, to observe, to listen, to see if she could find any connection to Edward, to the Nightingale, to the conspiracy that had claimed his life. She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were inconspicuous but elegant, a simple black dress, a dark coat, a small hat that partially concealed her face. She wanted to blend in, to appear unremarkable, to avoid drawing attention to herself. She arrived at Le Chat Noir in the late afternoon, as dusk was beginning to settle, casting long shadows across the narrow streets. The café was dimly lit, smoky, filled with a mixture of locals and foreigners, their conversations hushed, their glances guarded. She found a table in a corner, ordered a coffee, and pretended to read a newspaper, her eyes scanning the room, her ears straining to catch any snippet of conversation, any clue that might be relevant. She spent hours there, observing the comings and goings, the whispered exchanges, the furtive glances. She saw men in dark suits, women in elegant dresses, soldiers in uniform, all mingling together, their faces betraying nothing, their secrets carefully guarded. She heard snippets of conversations, fragments of information, references to coded messages, to clandestine meetings, to the war, to the aftermath, to the ongoing struggle for power and influence. She saw a woman, tall, slender, with dark hair, wearing a distinctive red scarf. The Nightingale? Lillian's heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She watched the woman, her eyes fixed on her, her mind racing. The woman was sitting at a table with a man in a military uniform, a man Lillian recognized. It was Nathaniel. Lillian felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a chilling sense of déjà vu. She had seen them together, in her mind, in her nightmares, in the fragments of Edward's memories. But seeing them together now, in the flesh, in this clandestine setting, confirmed her worst fears, solidified her suspicions. Nathaniel was not just connected to Edward, he was connected to the Nightingale. He was part of the conspiracy, part of the network of spies and informants, part of the betrayal that had led to her brother's murder. Lillian watched them, her heart breaking, her mind reeling. They were talking quietly, their heads close together, their expressions serious. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see the intimacy between them, the familiarity, the shared secrets. She saw Nathaniel hand the woman something, a small, folded piece of paper. The woman took it, slipped it into her purse, and nodded. It was a transaction, an exchange of information, a betrayal of trust. Lillian felt a surge of anger, of hatred, of a desperate need for revenge. She wanted to confront them, to expose them, to scream, but she knew she couldn't. She was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, outgunned. She had to be careful. She had to be patient. She had to play the game. She paid the price for her loyalty to her brother, and it pained her to see that Nathaniel was not who she'd thought. She stood up, her legs trembling, and walked out of the cafe, leaving them there, alone in their web of lies and deceit. She walked back to the hotel, her mind racing, her heart aching, her determination hardening. She had seen the truth. She had witnessed the betrayal. She had identified the players. Now, she had to find a way to expose them, to bring them to justice, to avenge her brother's death. The price of loyalty was high, but she was willing to pay it, even if it meant sacrificing everything, including the man she had once loved. Chapter 12. A Stolen Kiss in the Ruins. The revelation at Le Chat Noir had left Lillian reeling, her emotions a turbulent mix of betrayal, anger, and a lingering, heartbreaking sense of loss. She had seen Nathaniel, the man she loved, the man she had trusted, consorting with a nightingale, the woman who might have been responsible for her brother's death. It was a scene that played on repeat in her mind, each replay twisting the knife of betrayal deeper. Yet, amidst the turmoil, a sliver of doubt remained. A tiny voice, whispering against the overwhelming evidence, questioned the simplicity of her conclusions. Could Nathaniel truly be a traitor? Could the man who had held her, comforted her, shared his deepest scars with her, be capable of such cold-blooded deception? She needed answers. She needed to confront him, to hear his explanation, to see the truth in his eyes, even if that truth was a devastating confirmation of her worst fears. She found him in the hotel's small, deserted library, a room filled with dusty books and the faint scent of mildew. He was standing by the window, gazing out at the rain-soaked streets of Amiens, his posture rigid, his expression troubled. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice trembling, her presence shattering the silence. He turned, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing with a mixture of guilt and apprehension. He knew that she had seen him, that she had witnessed his betrayal. "Lillian," he said, his voice low, his tone guarded. "I was going to tell you." "Tell me what?" she demanded, her voice rising, her anger flaring. "Tell me that you're a spy? That you're working with the nightingale? That you killed my brother?" He flinched, his face paling. "No," he said, his voice shaking. "It's not like that. I can explain." "Explain?" she repeated, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Explain how you were seen handing her a message? Explain how you were sitting with her, whispering secrets, plotting what?" He ran a hand through his hair, his expression anguished. I was trying to protect you," he said, his voice pleading. "I was trying to protect Edward. I was playing a role." "A role?" Lillian scoffed. "A role as a traitor? A role as a murderer?" He stepped towards her, his hands reaching out, but she recoiled, refusing his touch. "Lillian, please," he said, his voice desperate. "You have to believe me. I was working undercover. I was trying to infiltrate the Nightingale's network. I was trying to find out who killed Edward." His words were a torrent, a desperate attempt to justify his actions, to convince her of his innocence. But Lillian was no longer sure she could believe anything he said. The locket, the meeting at the cafe, the circumstantial evidence, it all pointed to a different truth. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you keep it a secret? Why did you lie to me?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. I couldn't risk it," he said, his voice low. "I didn't know who I could trust. I didn't know who was involved." "And you thought I might be involved?" Lillian asked, her voice filled with hurt and disbelief. He looked at her, his eyes filled with pain. "No," he said softly. "Never. But I had to be careful. I had to protect you. I had to follow my orders." "Orders?" The word hung in the air, a stark reminder of the military world he inhabited, a world of secrets, of deception, of betrayal. A world she didn't understand, a world that had now shattered her own. "Whose orders?" Lillian demanded. "Who are you working for?" He hesitated again, his gaze flickering towards the door, as if expecting someone to appear. I can't tell you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's classified." Classified. Another word that separated them, another wall between them, another layer of secrecy. Lillian felt a surge of frustration, of anger, of a desperate need for the truth. She stepped closer to him, her voice low, her gaze intense. "Nathaniel," she said, "look at me. Look me in the eyes and tell me, did you kill my brother?" He met her gaze, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of pain, of guilt, of something else. Something she couldn't quite decipher. "No," he said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. I did not kill Edward.
I swear to you, Lillian.
I could never. His voice trailed off, his eyes searching hers, pleading for her to believe him. And in that moment, despite everything, despite the evidence, despite the betrayal, Lillian saw a flicker of the man she had loved, a glimpse of the truth beneath the lies. She didn't know what to believe. She was torn between her head and her heart, between the evidence and her intuition, between the logical conclusions and the lingering hope. She reached out, her hand touching his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines of his face, the scars of his past. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, his body trembling. I don't know what to believe anymore, Lillian whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with hers. Believe this, he said, his voice low, his tone intense. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. A tentative kiss, a hesitant exploration, a fragile bridge between the past and the present. It deepened, becoming more passionate, more desperate, a desperate clinging to each other in the face of the darkness that surrounded them. It was a stolen kiss, a forbidden kiss, a kiss in the ruins of their trust, a kiss that might be their last. It was a kiss that said more than words ever could, a kiss that spoke of love, of loss, of betrayal, of hope, of a desperate yearning for a future that might never be. And as they broke apart, a single gunshot echoed through the quiet hotel, leaving Lillian to wonder if she'd just kissed a ghost. Chapter 13. The Heartbreak Telegram. The gunshot shattered the fragile intimacy, the desperate hope that had flickered between Lillian and Nathaniel. It was a single, sharp report, echoing through the quiet hotel, followed by a sickening silence. Lillian recoiled, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes widening in horror. Nathaniel, his body tensing, his instincts honed by years of war, immediately pushed her behind him, shielding her with his own body. Stay here, he commanded, his voice low, his tone urgent. Don't move. He drew a small pistol from his coat pocket, a weapon she hadn't known he carried. He moved swiftly and silently towards the door, his eyes scanning the hallway, his body poised for action. Lillian, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing, disobeyed him. She couldn't stay there, cowering in fear, while he risked his life. She had to know what had happened, who had fired the shot, who had been hit. She followed him, staying close behind, her eyes darting around, her senses on high alert. The hallway was deserted, eerily silent, the only sound the faint echo of the gunshot. They moved cautiously, checking each room, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. They found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no trace of an intruder, no body. They reached the end of the hallway, where a staircase led down to the lobby. Nathaniel, his pistol still raised, peered cautiously over the railing. Lillian, following close behind, gasped. Below, in the dimly lit lobby, a figure lay sprawled on the floor, motionless, surrounded by a growing pool of blood. It was Mr. Finch, the man from the War Office, the man who had brought them to Amiens, the man who had been leading the investigation into Edward's death. Nathaniel, his face pale, his jaw tight, descended the stairs, his pistol still at the ready. Lillian followed, her legs trembling, her stomach churning. They reached the lobby, approaching the body cautiously. Mr. Finch lay on his back, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, his chest stained crimson.
He was dead.
Lillian felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a chilling sense of déjà vu. Another death, another victim, another layer of the conspiracy unfolding before her eyes. Nathaniel knelt beside the body, checking for a pulse, confirming the obvious. He looked up at Lillian, his expression grim. He's gone, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He searched the body, finding nothing, no weapon, no note, no clue as to who had killed him. Who would do this? Lillian whispered, her voice trembling. Nathaniel shook his head, his expression troubled. I don't know, he said. But I think we just became the prime suspects. His words sent a chill down Lillian's spine. He was right. They were alone in the hotel, with a dead body of a government official. They had no witnesses, no alibi, No way to prove their innocence. They were trapped, caught in a web of conspiracy and murder, with no one to trust, no one to turn to. Suddenly, a shout from the front desk broke the silence. What was that? What happened? It was the hotel clerk, alerted by the gunshot, his voice filled with alarm. Nathaniel grabbed Lillian's hand, his grip tight. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent.
Now.
They fled, running through the back entrance of the hotel, disappearing into the dark, rain-soaked streets of Amiens, leaving behind the dead body, the unanswered questions, the shattered remnants of their lives. They ran for blocks, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones, their hearts pounding in their chests. They didn't know where they were going, only that they had to get away, that they had to escape, that they had to survive. They found refuge in a small, abandoned church, its windows boarded up, its doors unlocked, its interior dark and desolate. They huddled together in a corner, shivering from the cold, their bodies trembling, their minds racing. What are we going to do?" Lillian whispered, her voice choked with fear. Nathaniel, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and despair, didn't answer. He knew that their situation was dire, that they were hunted, that they were running out of time. And then, as if to confirm their worst fears, a telegram arrived. Delivered by a young boy, breathless and wide-eyed, who thrust the crumpled envelope into Lillian's hand and then vanished as quickly as he had appeared. Lillian, her fingers trembling, tore open the envelope. The message was brief, stark, and devastating, another blow to her already shattered heart. Nathaniel Blackwood, identified AS double agent, stop working with the Nightingale, stop arrest on site, stop War Office, stop. The telegram slipped from her grasp, fluttering to the floor like a fallen leaf. The words swam before her eyes, blurring into an incomprehensible mess. Nathaniel, a double agent, working with the Nightingale. The man she loved, the man she had trusted, the man who had sworn to protect her, a traitor. It was the final, crushing blow, the ultimate betrayal, the end of everything. The telegram, delivered with such cruel efficiency, was a pronouncement of doom, a sentence of heartbreak, a final whisper from a world that had gone completely mad. Chapter 14. Between Duty and Desire. The abandoned church, with its crumbling walls and echoing silence, became a sanctuary of shattered trust and agonizing decisions. Lillian, clutching the devastating telegram, stared at Nathaniel, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief, betrayal, and a lingering, heartbreaking tenderness. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her throat tight with unshed tears. "Are you a double agent?" Nathaniel, his face pale, his eyes shadowed with a mixture of guilt and defiance, didn't answer immediately. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the stained glass window, the fragmented images of saints and angels seeming to mock their predicament. "Lillian, he began, his voice faltering, his words struggling to find their way through the labyrinth of lies and deceptions that had defined their relationship. "Don't lie to me, Nathaniel," Lillian pleaded, her voice cracking, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, then hesitating, withdrawing before making contact.
Not now.
Not after everything. He turned to face her, his blue eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. He took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping, his posture losing its soldierly rigidity. "It's complicated," he said, his voice low, his tone weary. "More complicated than you can imagine." "Complicated?" Lillian repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Complicated how?" "Complicated because you're working for both sides? Complicated because you betrayed your country? Complicated because you killed Mr. Finch?" He flinched, his face paling even further. "No," he said, his voice shaking. "I didn't kill Finch.
I swear to you, Lillian."
I was trying to protect him. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me?" Lillian scoffed. "By lying to me? By consorting with the Nightingale? By being a traitor?" He stepped towards her, his hands reaching out, but she recoiled, refusing his touch. "Lillian, please," he said, his voice desperate. "You have to believe me. I had no choice. I was following orders." "Orders?" Lillian repeated, her voice rising. Whose orders? The War Office? The Nightingale? Who are you really working for, Nathaniel? He hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the door, as if expecting someone to appear. I can't tell you, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's classified. It's bigger than both of us. Bigger than both of us. The words echoed the vast, impersonal forces that had shaped their lives. The war, the espionage, the political machinations, the forces that had brought them together and now threatened to tear them apart. Lillian felt a surge of anger, of frustration, of a desperate need to understand. She stepped closer to him, her voice low, her gaze intense. Nathaniel, she said, look at me. Look me in the eyes and tell me, are you working with the Nightingale? Are you a traitor? He met her gaze, his blue eyes unwavering, filled with a complex mixture of emotions. He opened his mouth to speak, then hesitated, his jaw tightening, his expression conflicted. I am loyal to my country, he said finally, his voice firm, his words carefully chosen. But my country is not always what it seems. His words were cryptic, ambiguous, offering no clear answers, no definitive proof of his innocence or guilt. He was walking a tightrope, balancing between duty and desire, between loyalty and betrayal, between the truth and the lies. Lillian, torn between her head and her heart, between the evidence and her intuition, didn't know what to believe. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe in his innocence. She wanted to cling to the hope that their love was not a lie. But the telegram, the evidence, the circumstances, it all pointed to a different truth, a truth that threatened to destroy everything she held dear. She turned away from him, her body trembling, her mind reeling. She walked towards the altar, the crumbling stone a symbol of the shattered faith, the broken trust, the lost innocence. I don't know what to do, Lillian whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Nathaniel followed her, his footsteps echoing in the silent church. He stood behind her, his presence a comforting warmth, a dangerous temptation. We have to get out of here, he said, his voice low, his tone urgent. We have to disappear. Disappear. The word echoed the hopelessness of their situation, the impossibility of their escape, the finality of their separation. Lillian turned to face him, her eyes filled with tears. And then what? She asked, her voice breaking. Run forever? Hide forever? Live alive forever? He reached out, his hand touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the tears that streamed down her face. We'll find a way, he said, his voice soft, his tone reassuring. We'll find a way to clear my name, to be together. It was a promise, a desperate plea, a fragile hope in the face of overwhelming odds. But Lillian didn't know if she could believe him, didn't know if she could trust him, didn't know if she could ever forgive him. She looked into his eyes, searching for the truth, searching for the man she had loved, searching for a reason to believe. And in that moment, caught between duty and desire, between loyalty and betrayal, between the past and the future, she made a decision. A decision that would change their lives forever. A decision born of desperation, of love, of a fierce determination to survive. She was trapped between her duty to her brother and country and her desire for the man standing before her. Chapter 15. The Masks We Wear. The decision Lillian made was not a logical one, not a rational one, but one born of instinct, of intuition, of a desperate hope that the man she loved was not the monster the evidence suggested. She decided to trust Nathaniel, to give him the benefit of the doubt, to help him escape, to buy him time, to uncover the truth, even if that truth meant confirming her worst fears. We need to leave Amiens, Lillian said, her voice firm, her resolve hardening. Immediately. Before they find us. Nathaniel nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. I have a contact, he said. Someone who can help us. Someone who owes me a favor. He led her out of the church, back into the rain-soaked streets of Amiens, their footsteps echoing in the darkness, their movements furtive, their glances guarded. They were fugitives, hunted by both sides, caught in a web of espionage and betrayal, with no one to trust but each other. They walked for miles, avoiding the main roads, sticking to the back alleys, the narrow passageways, the hidden corners of the town. They reached the outskirts of Amiens, where the fields began, stretching out towards the horizon, a vast expanse of darkness and uncertainty. Nathaniel led her to a small, isolated farmhouse, its windows dark, its doors shut, its surroundings silent and deserted. He knocked on the door, a coded sequence of taps, a signal known only to a select few. The door opened, revealing a man, tall and gaunt, with weathered features and wary eyes. He was a farmer, his clothes worn and patched, his hands rough and calloused. He was also, Lillian realized, a soldier, a veteran of the war, a man who had seen his share of death and destruction. Nathaniel spoke to the man in rapid French, his words hushed, his tone urgent. The man listened intently, his eyes flickering towards Lillian, assessing her, questioning her presence. Nathaniel introduced her, explaining their situation, vouching for her trustworthiness, pleading for his help. The man hesitated, his gaze lingering on Lillian, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, his reluctance giving way to a sense of duty, of loyalty, of a bond forged in the crucible of war. He ushered them inside, closing the door behind them, shutting out the darkness, shutting out the danger, shutting out the world. The farmhouse was small and sparsely furnished, its interior lit by a single oil lamp, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a familiar, comforting smell that reminded Lillian of her childhood, of a time before the war, before the betrayal, before the lies. The farmer, whose name was Jean-Pierre, offered them food and shelter, a meager meal of bread and cheese, a warm bed in a small, attic room. He asked no questions, offered no judgments, simply provided them with a safe haven, a temporary respite from the storm that raged outside. As they ate, Lillian watched Nathaniel, studying his face, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of guilt, any clue that might reveal his true allegiance. He seemed tired, worn, his usual confidence replaced by a vulnerability, a weariness that touched her heart.
Who is he?
Lillian asked, her voice low, her gaze fixed on Nathaniel. How do you know him? Nathaniel hesitated, his eyes flickering towards Jean-Pierre, who was sitting across the room, silently watching them. He served with me, Nathaniel said, his voice hesitant. In the trenches. I saved his life.
Once.
It was a story Lillian had heard before, a story of bravery, of loyalty, of a bond forged in the face of death. But this time, it felt different, tainted by the suspicion, by the doubt, by the knowledge of Nathaniel's potential betrayal. And he owes you for that? Lillian asked, her voice laced with skepticism. Nathaniel nodded. In this world, he said, his voice grim, a life debt is a powerful thing. It's a currency that transcends borders, that defies allegiances, that binds men together. It was a currency, Lillian realized, that Nathaniel had used to his advantage, a currency that had allowed him to navigate the treacherous world of espionage, to build alliances, to secure favors, to survive. But it was also a currency that could be corrupted, that could be used for nefarious purposes, that could be used to betray, to deceive, to kill. As they prepared for bed, Lillian couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense of impending doom, the knowledge that their sanctuary was temporary, that their escape was fleeting, that their pursuers were closing in. They lay in the small, attic room, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words, with unanswered questions, with the lingering tension of their fractured trust. Lillian turned to Nathaniel, her voice barely a whisper. What are we going to do? He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and despair. We're going to find the nightingale, he said, his voice firm. We're going to uncover the truth. We're going to clear my name. It was a promise, a vow, a declaration of intent. But Lillian knew that it was also a gamble, a dangerous game, a desperate attempt to reclaim their lives, to restore their love, to find redemption in a world of shadows and lies. Everyone wore masks, and she was starting to realize they hid a multitude of sins, a complex web of deceit that ran deeper than she could ever have imagined. The masks we wear, she thought, are often more revealing than the faces they conceal. Chapter 16. A tapestry of betrayals. The farmhouse, while a temporary sanctuary, felt increasingly like a cage. The walls, meant to protect them, also confined them, amplifying the tension between Lillian and Nathaniel. The unspoken accusations, the lingering doubts, the weight of the telegram hung heavy in the air. Jean-Pierre, their taciturn host, provided them with information, gleaned from his network of contacts, whispers from the war-torn countryside. He spoke of rumors, of suspicious movements, of coded messages intercepted by resistance fighters. He spoke of a growing network of spies, operating in the shadows, manipulating events, controlling the flow of information. He spoke of the Nightingale, a name whispered with fear and respect, a master of disguise, a puppeteer pulling the strings of both sides, a figure shrouded in mystery and intrigue. Nathaniel, using Jean-Pierre's information and his own knowledge of the espionage network, began to piece together the fragments of the puzzle, to connect the dots, to unravel the tapestry of betrayals that had led to Edward's death and Mr. Finch's murder. He discovered that the Nightingale was not just a spy, but a double agent, working for both the British and the Germans, playing both sides against each other, profiting from the chaos and destruction of war. He also discovered that the Nightingale had a network of informants, of collaborators, of accomplices, spread throughout France and England, occupying positions of power and influence, manipulating events from within. He learned that Mr. Finch had been close to uncovering the Nightingale's identity, that he had gathered evidence, that he had been about to expose the entire network. That was why he had been killed, silenced before he could reveal the truth. And he learned, with a growing sense of horror, that Edward had been used, manipulated, and ultimately betrayed by the very people he had trusted, by the people he had considered his friends, by the people he had loved, including, perhaps, Nathaniel himself. The evidence, while circumstantial, was mounting. Nathaniel's connection to Edward, the locket, the meeting at Le Chat Noir, the telegram accusing him of being a double agent, it all pointed to a disturbing conclusion. But Lillian, despite the evidence, despite the doubts, despite the logical conclusions, refused to believe that Nathaniel was the mastermind, the ultimate betrayer. She clung to the hope that he was innocent, that he was a victim of circumstance, that he was being framed, that he was playing a deeper game, a game she didn't yet understand. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence between them thick with unspoken emotions, Lillian decided to confront him, to challenge him, to force him to reveal the truth, once and for all. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "Tell me everything. Tell me the truth. No more secrets, no more lies, no more evasions." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resignation. He knew that he could no longer hide, that he could no longer avoid the inevitable confrontation. He took a deep breath and began to speak. He told her about his recruitment into the intelligence service, about his training, about his mission to infiltrate the German espionage network. He told her about his relationship with Edward, about their friendship, about their shared ideals, about their collaboration in gathering information for the British. He told her about the Nightingale, about his efforts to identify her, to expose her, to bring her to justice. He told her about the meeting at Le Chat Noir, about his attempt to gain the Nightingale's trust, to extract information from her, to set a trap for her. He told her about the telegram, about the accusation of being a double agent, about his belief that he was being framed, that he was being set up by the Nightingale, by her network, by her powerful allies. He told her everything, or so he claimed. He revealed the layers of deception, the intricate web of betrayals, the complex tapestry of lies that had defined their world. But as he spoke, Lillian noticed something, a subtle hesitation, a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a slight tremor in his voice. He was holding something back, concealing a piece of the puzzle, a secret that he was still unwilling to share. "There's something you're not telling me, Nathaniel," Lillian said, her voice soft but firm. "Something about the locket, about your relationship with Edward, about your true allegiance." He flinched, his gaze shifting away from hers, his face paling. He knew that she had seen through him, that she had sensed his deception, that she had uncovered his hidden truth. He hesitated, his internal struggle evident, his loyalty torn between his duty, his mission, and his love for Lillian. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper, his words revealing a secret that would change everything, a secret that would expose the true depths of the betrayal, a secret that would unravel the entire tapestry of lies. The tapestry, woven with threads of duty, love, and deception, was about to be torn apart, revealing a pattern far more intricate and devastating than Lillian could have ever imagined. Chapter 17. The Unveiling. The secret Nathaniel finally revealed was not a single, shocking revelation, but rather a series of interconnected truths, each more painful, more devastating than the last. It was a confession that shattered the remaining fragments of Lillian's illusions, that exposed the depths of the conspiracy, and that ultimately redefined her understanding of love, loyalty, and betrayal. The locket, Nathaniel began, his voice trembling, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and regret, was not a token of romantic affection. It was a signal, a means of communication. He explained that Edward, while working as a doctor in Amiens, had stumbled upon evidence of a German espionage network operating within the British ranks. He had begun gathering information, discreetly, cautiously, hoping to expose the traitors and bring them to justice. But Edward had been naive, idealistic, unaware of the true extent of the conspiracy, of the ruthlessness of his enemies, of the dangers he faced. He had trusted the wrong people, shared his suspicions with the wrong individuals, walked into a trap that had been carefully laid for him. Nathaniel, working undercover for British intelligence, had been tasked with monitoring Edward, with protecting him, with guiding him through the treacherous world of espionage. He had been ordered to maintain a close relationship with Edward, to gain his trust, to extract information from him, to use him as a pawn in a larger game. The locket had been a way for them to communicate, a way for Edward to pass on information, a way for Nathaniel to receive instructions from his superiors. The inscription, to E, from N, with love always had been a code, a signal that only they understood. I was supposed to protect him, Nathaniel said, his voice choked with emotion. I was supposed to keep him safe. But I failed. I failed him. I failed you. He explained that the Nightingale, a master of manipulation, had discovered Edward's activities, had identified him as a threat, had ordered his elimination. She had used her network of informants, her collaborators, her accomplices, to frame Edward, to discredit him, to make him appear to be a traitor. She had also used Nathaniel, manipulating him, feeding him false information, playing on his loyalty, his sense of duty, his love for Lillian. She had used him as a pawn in her game, a tool to achieve her own ends. I didn't know, Nathaniel pleaded, his voice desperate.
I didn't know she was using me. I didn't know she was the Nightingale. I swear to you, Lillian.
I would never have betrayed Edward.
Or you.
But his words, while heartfelt, while seemingly sincere, couldn't erase the truth, couldn't undo the damage, couldn't bring back the dead. The meeting at Le Chat Noir, Nathaniel explained, had been a desperate attempt to uncover the Nightingale's identity, to gather evidence against her, to expose her network. He had been playing a dangerous game, walking a tightrope between loyalty and betrayal, risking his own life to bring her to justice. The telegram, accusing him of being a double agent, had been a fabrication, a lie planted by the Nightingale, a way to discredit him, to remove him from the equation, to protect herself and her network. She's one step ahead of us, Lillian, Nathaniel said, his voice grim. She's always one step ahead. She's a master of deception, a master of manipulation, a master of evil. Lillian listened to his confession, her heart aching, her mind reeling. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to forgive him. But the doubts lingered. The suspicions remained. The wounds of betrayal were still raw. And Mr. Finch? Lillian asked, her voice barely a whisper. Did you kill him? Nathaniel shook his head, his eyes filled with horror. No, he said firmly. I swear to you, Lillian. I would never. He was a good man.
He was on our side.
The nightingale, she killed him. She silenced him before he could expose her. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the ultimate confirmation of the nightingale's ruthlessness, of her power, of her reach. Lillian, overwhelmed by the revelations, by the weight of the truth, by the sheer scale of the conspiracy, felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had lost her brother, her husband, her trust, her love, her innocence. She had been caught in a web of lies and deceit, manipulated by forces beyond her control, betrayed by the people she had trusted most. She looked at Nathaniel, his face etched with pain, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and regret. He was not the monster she had feared, but he was not the hero she had hoped for either. He was a flawed, complex, compromised individual, caught in a web of his own making, a victim of circumstance, a pawn in a larger game. The unveiling was complete. The truth exposed, like a raw nerve, throbbing with pain, with loss, with the bitter taste of betrayal. Chapter 18. Flight from the past. The farmhouse, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb, the weight of Nathaniel's confession pressing down on Lillian, suffocating her. She knew they couldn't stay there, that the nightingale's reach was long, that their pursuers were closing in. We have to leave, Lillian said, her voice firm, her resolve hardening. We have to disappear. Before it's too late. Nathaniel nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of agreement and resignation. He knew that their time was running out, that their options were dwindling, that their only chance of survival lay in escape. Jean-Pierre, their stoic host, offered them assistance, providing them with forged papers, a map, and a small amount of money. He also arranged for transportation, a battered old truck that would take them to the coast, where they could board a ship bound for England. They left the farmhouse under the cover of darkness, their movements furtive, their glances guarded, their hearts pounding in their chests. They were fugitives, hunted by both sides, caught in a web of espionage and betrayal, with no one to trust but each other. The journey to the coast was long and arduous, the roads bumpy, the weather harsh, the fear constant. They drove through the night, avoiding the main highways, sticking to the back roads, the country lanes, the hidden paths. They spoke little, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions, with unanswered questions, with the lingering tension of their fractured trust. Lillian, despite Nathaniel's confession, still harbored doubts, still questioned his motives, still struggled to reconcile the man she loved with the man who had been involved in such a dark and dangerous world. As they neared the coast, the sky began to lighten, the first rays of dawn painting the horizon with hues of pink and orange. They reached a small, secluded fishing village, a cluster of ramshackle houses huddled around a sheltered cove. Jean-Pierre had arranged for them to meet a contact, a fisherman who would smuggle them onto a cargo ship bound for London. They found the fisherman, a grizzled old man with weathered features and knowing eyes, waiting for them on the docks. The fisherman, after a brief exchange with Nathaniel, led them to a small, battered fishing boat, its hull scarred and patched, its sails tattered and worn. He instructed them to hide in the hold, a dark, cramped space filled with the stench of fish and seawater. They boarded the boat, their movements cautious, their hearts pounding, their hopes fragile. The fishermen cast off, the engines sputtering to life, the boat chugging slowly out of the harbor, leaving behind the village, leaving behind France, leaving behind the past. As the boat sailed further out to sea, Lillian felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. They were escaping, fleeing the immediate danger, but they were also sailing into the unknown, into a future that was uncertain, into a world that was filled with peril. She looked at Nathaniel, his face pale and drawn, his eyes fixed on the receding coastline. He was silent, lost in his thoughts, his emotions hidden beneath a mask of stoicism. "Where will we go?" Lillian asked, her voice barely a whisper, her hand reaching out to touch his, seeking a connection, a reassurance, a sign of hope. He turned to her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "We'll go to London," he said, his voice firm. We'll find the nightingale. We'll expose her. We'll clear my name. It was a promise, a vow, a declaration of intent. But it was also a gamble, a dangerous game, a desperate attempt to reclaim their lives, to restore their love, to find redemption in a world of shadows and lies. Lillian nodded, her heart aching, her mind racing. She knew that the journey ahead would be perilous, that the odds were stacked against them, that the nightingale was a formidable opponent. But she also knew that she couldn't give up, that she couldn't abandon Nathaniel, that she couldn't let the past consume them. She had to fight. She had to survive. She had to find a way to rebuild her life, to restore her trust, to reclaim her love. The boat sailed on, carrying them across the choppy waters, towards an uncertain future, towards a confrontation that would determine their fate, towards a reckoning that would expose the truth and bring justice to the victims of the nightingale's treachery. The flight from the past was not an escape, but a pursuit, a desperate chase for truth and redemption in a world shrouded in darkness. Chapter 19. Where the Poppies Bloom. London, shrouded in a November fog, felt both familiar and alien to Lillian. The city, still recovering from the war, bore its own scars, its own secrets, its own tapestry of betrayals. It was a place of refuge and danger, of hope and despair, of past memories and uncertain futures. Nathaniel, using his contacts and his knowledge of the city, secured a small, discreet apartment in a quiet neighborhood, far from the bustling crowds and the prying eyes of the authorities. It was a temporary haven, a place to regroup, to plan their next move, to prepare for the final confrontation with the nightingale. They lived a life of shadows, moving cautiously, speaking in whispers, trusting no one. They spent their days poring over Edward's journal, studying the coded entries, searching for any clue that might lead them to the nightingale's identity, to her network, to her lair. They discovered that the nightingale was not just a spy, but a master manipulator, a puppeteer pulling the strings of powerful people, controlling the flow of information, influencing the course of events. She had infiltrated the highest levels of British society, had corrupted politicians, had compromised military officials, had woven a web of deceit that stretched across continents. They also discovered that the nightingale had a personal vendetta against Lillian's family, a motive rooted in the past, in a long-forgotten feud, in a betrayal that had spanned generations. The details were vague, fragmented, hidden within the coded entries of Edward's journal, but the implications were clear. Lillian was not just a pawn in the nightingale's game, she was a target. Nathaniel, driven by guilt and a fierce determination to protect Lillian, intensified his efforts to uncover the nightingale's identity. He used his contacts within the intelligence service, risking exposure, risking his own life, to gather information, to follow leads, to piece together the fragments of the puzzle. He learned that the nightingale was planning a final, devastating act of sabotage, an act that would cripple the British war effort, an act that would cost thousands of lives, an act that would solidify her power and secure her legacy. He also learned that the nightingale was planning to meet with her collaborators, to finalize her plans, to execute her scheme. The meeting was to take place at a secluded estate outside London, a place known for its beautiful gardens, a place where poppies bloomed even in the late autumn, a place that held a dark and sinister secret. Nathaniel knew that this was their chance, their opportunity to stop the nightingale, to expose her, to bring her to justice. But he also knew that it was a trap, a dangerous game, a desperate gamble. He shared his findings with Lillian, his voice grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and fear. "We have to go there," he said. "We have to stop her. We have to end this." Lillian, despite her fear, despite her doubts, despite the lingering pain of betrayal, agreed. She knew that they couldn't run forever, that they couldn't hide in the shadows, that they had to confront the nightingale, that they had to fight for their lives, for their love, for their future. They prepared for their mission, gathering weapons, forging documents, planning their strategy. They were outnumbered, outgunned, outmaneuvered, but they were also driven by a fierce determination, by a burning desire for justice, by a desperate hope for redemption. They traveled to the estate under the cover of darkness, their movements cautious, their glances guarded, their hearts pounding in their chests. The estate was vast and imposing, surrounded by high walls, guarded by armed men, shrouded in an atmosphere of secrecy and menace. They infiltrated the estate, using their skills, their cunning, their knowledge of the terrain. They moved through the shadows, avoiding the guards, bypassing the security measures, navigating the labyrinthine corridors. They reached the gardens, a beautiful, tranquil space, filled with the scent of roses and lavender, and the vibrant red of the poppies, a stark reminder of the blood that had been spilled, of the lives that had been lost, of the betrayals that had been committed. And there, in the center of the garden, standing amidst the blooming poppies, they found her, the nightingale, the woman who had haunted their dreams, who had shattered their lives, who had orchestrated the deaths of Edward and Mr. Finch, who had betrayed her country, who had manipulated them all. She was not what Lillian had expected. She was not a monster, not a villain, not a caricature of evil. She was a woman, elegant and refined, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, a woman who looked strikingly familiar, a woman who held a secret that would change everything, a woman who was, shockingly, intimately connected to Lillian's own past. The place where the poppies bloomed was not just a scene of beauty, but a battlefield of secrets, a garden of betrayal, a testament to the enduring power of the past. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The Nightingale's identity was the final, devastating twist, the ultimate betrayal. She was not a stranger, not an enemy, but someone Lillian knew, someone she had trusted, someone she had once considered a friend. She was Lady Beatrice Ashworth, a prominent figure in London society, a patron of the arts, a philanthropist, a widow of a decorated war hero. She was also Lillian's aunt, her mother's younger sister, a woman who had been a part of Lillian's life since childhood. The revelation struck Lillian with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless, stunned, reeling with disbelief. She stared at Beatrice, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of the elegant, sophisticated woman before her with the ruthless, cunning spy who had orchestrated so much death and destruction. "Aunt Beatrice?" Lillian whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock and horror. You are the Nightingale?" Beatrice smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a shiver down Lillian's spine. "Yes, my dear," she said, her voice smooth and silky, devoid of any remorse or regret. "I am." She gestured towards the blooming poppies, their vibrant red a stark contrast to the darkness of her soul. "Beautiful, aren't they?" she said. "They remind me of blood, of sacrifice, of victory." Nathaniel, his pistol drawn, his body tensed, stepped forward, his voice hard, his gaze unwavering. "It's over, Beatrice," he said. "We know everything. We know about your network, about your plans, about your betrayals." Beatrice laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the tranquil garden. "You know nothing," she said. "You are mere pawns in my game, insignificant players in a drama that has been unfolding for generations." She explained her motives, her vendetta against Lillian's family, a feud that had its roots in a long-forgotten betrayal, in a dispute over land, in a rivalry for power and influence. She had spent her life plotting her revenge, manipulating events, controlling people, orchestrating the downfall of her enemies. The war had been her opportunity, her chance to strike, her moment of triumph. She had used her position, her connections, her intelligence, to infiltrate the highest levels of British society, to gather information, to sabotage the war effort, to betray her country. Edward had been a threat, a loose end, a potential obstacle to her plans. She had used Nathaniel to eliminate him, to silence him, to remove him from the equation. Mr. Finch had been another obstacle, another threat, another victim of her ruthless ambition. Lillian, listening to Beatrice's cold, calculated confession, felt a surge of anger, of hatred, of a desperate need for justice. She stepped forward, her voice trembling with rage. You killed my brother," Lillian said, her voice choked with emotion. "You killed my husband. You destroyed my life." Beatrice shrugged, her expression indifferent. They were collateral damage, she said. Insignificant casualties in a larger war. A war I intend to win. She turned to Nathaniel, her eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and amusement.
And you, my dear Nathaniel, she said.
You were such a useful tool. So eager to please, so desperate for approval, so easily manipulated. Nathaniel flinched, his face paling, his jaw tightening. He had been used, betrayed, played for a fool. He had trusted the wrong person, loved the wrong woman, fought for the wrong cause. You won't get away with this, Beatrice, Nathaniel said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. It's over. Beatrice smiled, a cold, confident smile. Oh, I think not, my dear, she said. You see, I have insurance. She gestured towards the shadows, and from the darkness emerged a group of armed men, their faces hidden, their weapons trained on Lillian and Nathaniel. They were surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned. A standoff ensued, a tense, silent confrontation, the air thick with the threat of violence, the promise of death. Lillian and Nathaniel, their backs against the wall, their lives hanging in the balance, faced their final reckoning. The choice was stark: surrender or fight, betrayal or loyalty, love or duty. Nathaniel, his eyes meeting Lillian's, made his decision. He would not betray her again. He would not surrender. He would fight. He raised his pistol, aiming at Beatrice, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a shot rang out, a single, sharp report that echoed through the garden. Beatrice gasped, her eyes widening in surprise, her hand flying to her chest. She staggered, her body crumpling, collapsing onto the ground amidst the blooming poppies, her blood staining the vibrant red petals. Lillian and Nathaniel stared in shock, their minds reeling, their bodies frozen. They hadn't fired the shot. From the shadows, another figure emerged, a figure Lillian recognized, a figure she had thought lost, a figure she had mourned. It was Edward. He stood there, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and determination, a smoking pistol in his hand. He had survived, he had escaped, he had returned to seek justice, to avenge his family, to end the Nightingale's reign of terror. The reckoning was complete. Love and duty had collided, secrets had been revealed, betrayals had been exposed, and justice, however bloody, had been served. The poppies, symbols of remembrance, of sacrifice, of loss, now bore witness to the end of a dark and dangerous chapter, to the dawn of a new, uncertain future. The reckoning of love and duty had left scars, but also, perhaps, a path towards healing. Epilogue. The years that followed were a slow, gradual healing. The scars of the war, of the espionage, of the betrayals, remained, etched deep within Lillian and Nathaniel, a constant reminder of the darkness they had endured, of the losses they had suffered, of the love they had almost lost. Edward, having survived his supposed death, his escape orchestrated by a network of sympathetic doctors and resistance fighters, returned to England, a changed man. He had witnessed too much, suffered too much, lost too much. He could never fully return to his former life, to his former self. He dedicated his remaining years to helping other veterans, to healing the wounds of war, to advocating for peace. Lillian and Nathaniel, cleared of all charges, their names exonerated, their reputations restored, left London, seeking a quieter, simpler life, far from the intrigues and the betrayals of the political world. They settled in a small village in the countryside, surrounded by rolling hills and blooming meadows, a place where they could rebuild their lives, restore their trust, reclaim their love. They married, a quiet ceremony, attended only by a few close friends, a testament to their enduring bond, to their unwavering commitment, to their shared hope for a future free from shadows and lies. They never forgot the past, never forgot the sacrifices, never forgot the lessons they had learned. They honored the memory of those who had been lost, of Thomas, of Mr. Finch, of the countless others who had fallen victim to the Nightingale's treachery. They built a life together, a life based on trust, on honesty, on a deep and abiding love that had been forged in the crucible of war, tested by betrayal, and ultimately strengthened by adversity. Lillian found solace in writing, chronicling her experiences, sharing her story, bearing witness to the darkness and the light, the despair and the hope, the loss and the love. She wrote of the war, of the espionage, of the betrayals, but she also wrote of the resilience of the human spirit, of the power of forgiveness, of the enduring strength of love. Nathaniel, haunted by the ghosts of his past, found peace in working the land, in nurturing life, in creating beauty, in finding redemption in the simple rhythms of nature. He planted a garden filled with roses and lavender, and, in a secluded corner, a patch of poppies, a constant reminder of the blood that had been spilled, of the sacrifices that had been made, of the love that had endured. They had children, a son and a daughter, who grew up in a world free from the shadows of their parents' past, a world where they could learn and love and live without fear. And as the years passed, as the wounds healed, as the memories faded, Lillian and Nathaniel found a measure of peace, a sense of closure, a quiet joy in their shared life, in their enduring love, in the legacy they had created. The poppies continued to bloom, year after year, a vibrant reminder of the past, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a symbol of hope for the future. They were a reminder that even in the darkest of times, even in the face of unimaginable loss, even amidst the most profound betrayals, love can endure, hope can survive, and life can bloom again. The end.